Let me tell you something no one talks about. Avoidants don't hate love. They fear being consumed by it, but they still want it. And that's the twist. They don't fixate on partners who are too available. They zero in on the ones who feel just out of reach, the ones who light a fire without burning the house down. They'll tell themselves they're not interested. They'll play it cool. They'll ghost, disappear, pretend they're detached, but they're mind. And running marathons over someone who isn't even chasing them back, because it's not about who's right for them. It's about who makes them feel just unsafe enough to stay intrigued. They crave emotional stimulation without the emotional responsibility, and you'll see it. If you ever been the person they push away, but never quite let go of, if you've ever felt like they're half in, half out, that's not confusion. That's a pattern. Avoidants lock onto partners who validate their worth without forcing them to be vulnerable. And here's the key. They're not addicted to the person. They're addicted to the feeling, the fantasy, the hope, and maybe even the rejection. They think they want love, but only the kind they can imagine, not the kind they have to show up for. And the moment you stop chasing, they'll feel it. They'll feel the drop, because when their fantasy starts to collapse, that's when they fixate harder, not because they love you, but because losing you breaks the illusion they've been hiding in all along. Avoidants often carry an internal contradiction that's hard to detect on the surface. They appear cool, distant, maybe even aloof, but underneath that calm exterior is someone who deeply craves connection, just not in the way you might expect. The illusion of safety becomes their compass in relationships. They aren't necessarily looking for someone who's all in, fully available, or emotionally transparent. In fact, that kind of emotional openness feels overwhelming. It triggers the part of them that fears engulfment, the idea that intimacy might erase their sense of independence or pull them into emotional territory they don't know how to handle. So instead, they fixate on a partner who appears emotionally safe. But safe doesn't always mean emotionally healthy. In their world, safety often looks like emotional distance, someone who's a little unavailable, a little uncertain, someone who isn't fully showing their cards either. Why? Because that partner becomes a mirror. It allows the avoidant to engage in the relationship without ever feeling completely exposed. And when they find someone who seems emotionally self-sufficient, who doesn't push too hard, who maybe even plays it cool, something clicks. This person feels like the perfect balance of attraction and freedom. The avoidant can engage, flirt, text back and forth, maybe even show affection in small doses, all without having to dive into anything too emotionally charged. That partner becomes a kind of sweet spot, not too close to be threatening, not too distant to feel rejected. But the reality is this setup is built on illusion, because what the avoidant is actually doing is constructing a fantasy, one where connection is possible but still safely out of reach. This gives them the emotional stimulation they crave without the vulnerability they fear. It feels like love, but it's really control. And control, for the avoidant, is the real drug. They don't necessarily want to be in charge of the other person, but they do want to be in charge of how much they feel. They want to engage on their terms, open up when it's safe, pull back when it's too much. And the type of partner they fixate on allows that dynamic to play out. The illusion of safety is reinforced every time their partner doesn't demand more from them. Every time the other person doesn't call out the inconsistency, doesn't question the hot and cold behavior, doesn't push for more clarity. It's not seen as a red flag. It's seen as relief. It means they can stay in the game a little longer without risking emotional exposure. But here's where it gets complicated. The avoidant may tell themselves they're just taking it slow, or they're not sure yet, or they just haven't met the one. But all the while, they're fixating. They're thinking about this person constantly. They replay the conversations, analyze the texts, feel the spark when they see their name pop up on their phone. And yet they don't take that next step toward deeper intimacy. Why? Because doing so would require emotional vulnerability. It would require stepping out of the illusion and into the real, messy, unpredictable world of emotional closeness. And that feels dangerous. So the illusion becomes a safe space. It's where they can love from a distance, where they can maintain the fantasy of what could be without ever testing what is. This is why avoidants often become obsessed with someone who's slightly unavailable themselves, because that person validates their fear. If the other person isn't fully open, then the avoidant doesn't have to be either. They tell themselves it's just not the right time thing, or they're not sure how the other person feels, or they don't want to ruin a good thing by pushing too hard. But deep down, this is their way of keeping control of the emotional narrative. The illusion of safety also allows the avoidant to blame the dynamic on external factors. They might say, it's not that I'm afraid of intimacy, it's that they're so hard to read. Or I'd be more open if they gave me more signs. But that's projection. The truth is, the avoidant has chosen this dynamic, subconsciously or not, because it protects them. It keeps them from having to reveal their fears, their insecurities, their needs. It lets them live in the fantasy of connection without actually building it. The illusion creates just enough closeness to feel emotionally alive, but just enough distance to avoid true risk. And so they stay there, caught between the desire to be seen and the fear of being known. For the avoidant, attraction isn't just about the person, it's about the feeling, the thrill, the uncertainty, the pull-push dynamic that keeps their nervous system firing. What draws them in is rarely the steady, secure, emotionally present type. It's the one who gives them just enough to stay hooked, but not enough to feel settled. This dynamic fuels their desire because they're not chasing a person, they're chasing a state. That state is one of pursuit, of tension, of emotional stimulation. It gives them the sense of being alive, of wanting, of yearning, without the pressure of receiving, reciprocating, or actually being vulnerable. Once they get too close to the actual emotional availability of someone, the game changes. The chase starts to lose its charge, and the person no longer represents mystery or tension. They start to represent intimacy. And that's where the avoidant begins to retreat. That what they love is the dance, the in-between, the back and forth where nothing is certain, where feelings can be projected, but never truly tested. Because in the chase, there's room for fantasy. There's room to imagine the other person as perfect, desirable, safe, ideal. But once the person is fully available, once they say yes without hesitation, the avoidant is forced to confront the reality of intimacy. Now it's not about potential, it's about presence. Now it's not about imagining who the other person could be. It's about seeing them fully, flaws and all. And more importantly, it's about being seen. That's when their discomfort shows up, because the thrill of wanting is easier than the risk of being wanted. The avoidant attaches significance to effort. They equate wanting something with value. If it's hard to get, it must be worth it. If someone's just out of reach, they must be special. But what they're really doing is filtering attraction through fear, the fear of being hurt, consumed, rejected, or overwhelmed by someone else's needs. The chase gives them a reason to stay close without ever getting too close. It keeps them on the edge of emotional intimacy, where they feel just enough to be invested, but not enough to feel exposed. They'll often idealize the person they're chasing. They might think, if only they just choose me, everything would feel better. But what they don't realize is they're not actually preparing for the catch. They're emotionally wired for the pursuit. Once the other person reciprocates fully, the script flips. That intense desire starts to fade, not because they've changed their mind, but because the emotional stakes have shifted. Now, there's an expectation to show up consistently. Now, love means showing who you are, being accountable, letting someone into your emotional space. And that's when the avoidant panics. They might start pulling away. They create distance, come up with excuses, suddenly feel unsure. They blame timing, chemistry, compatibility. But it's not about the other person. It's about the internal dissonance between their desire for love and their fear of it. When the chase ends, they feel emotionally naked, vulnerable, out of control. And that discomfort is so great that they'd rather retreat into loneliness than risk being fully known. This is why you'll often see avoidants recycle old crushes or go back to people who were never quite available. Not because those connections were healthy, but because they allowed for the chase to remain intact. As long as there's uncertainty, the fantasy is alive. As long as there's space, they can project what they want onto the other person. But when the catch happens, when they finally have what they say they want, they're left with the reality. And that reality doesn't feel safe. It feels like exposure. So they leave, not because the connection wasn't real, but because it was, and that's what scares them. The chase allows the avoidant to feel powerful. It gives them emotional leverage. They're the one initiating, choosing, but directing the rhythm of the relationship. But the moment they have to receive, the moment they're invited into emotional reciprocity, they lose that power. They're no longer managing the emotional tempo. They're being asked to dance. And that dance requires trust, openness, and consistency, none of which feels safe to someone who's been trained, consciously or not, to associate intimacy with danger. The emotional high of pursuit gives them purpose. It keeps them distracted from their own emotional wounds. As long as they're chasing someone else, they don't have to face themselves. They don't have to sit with their own fear of abandonment, their unresolved grief, or their unmet emotional needs. The chase becomes a coping mechanism, a way to feel desire without risking connection, a way to stay close without ever touching the core of their vulnerability. For the avoidant, the greatest tension in any relationship lies between the need to feel wanted and the fear of being truly seen. They long to feel validated, admired, chosen, even pursued, but they want all of that without ever having to step into emotional exposure. A validation without vulnerability becomes their emotional currency. It's how they engage with love without risking the pain they associate with closeness. They want the compliments, the longing glances, the text messages that confirm they're missed, the interest that keeps them feeling significant. But when those things start to come attached to expectations, conversations about feelings, plans for the future, a deeper emotional availability, they begin to pull away because they never signed up for the emotional responsibility that comes with being wanted in a real, grounded way. The ideal scenario for an avoidant is a partner who gives them enough reassurance to feel secure, but not so much emotional intimacy that they feel trapped. They're drawn to admiration, even romantic intensity, as long as they're not required to match it with their own vulnerability. They might appear emotionally available in the beginning when the relationship is light and full of possibilities, but as soon as they sense that the other person is becoming emotionally invested, their discomfort starts to show. They begin to withdraw subtly, less affection, fewer replies, vague communication. But they still crave the validation, so they won't disappear entirely. They'll linger in the connection just enough to keep feeling wanted, but not so much that they have to actually engage emotionally. This is why so many avoidants are skilled at creating emotionally lopsided dynamics. They can make you feel chosen one moment and dismissed the next. They're not doing it out of malice, but as a way to maintain emotional control. They want to feel pursued without having to pursue back. They want affection that doesn't demand reciprocity. They want a partner who stays emotionally open without ever pushing them to be the same. That imbalance gives them a sense of safety. As long as the other person is doing the emotional heavy lifting, the avoidant can stay in the relationship without ever confronting their fear of true intimacy. Avoidants often seek out partners who are naturally nurturing, expressive, or even slightly anxious, because those partners are more likely to offer the steady stream of emotional feedback the avoidant needs in order to feel significant. But instead of reciprocating, the avoidant tends to protect themselves by staying emotionally guarded. They might offer moments of closeness, small bursts of connection that keep hope alive, but then they quickly return to emotional distance. They know how to give just enough to keep the other person engaged, and just little enough to avoid real vulnerability. The result is a confusing dynamic where the avoidant constantly tests the limits of how much validation they can receive without having to give more of themselves. They want to know they're still wanted, still desired, still important, but without stepping out of their emotional armor. And because the other person often becomes invested in trying to unlock their walls, it gives the avoidant even more emotional leverage. They get to feel valuable without having to take the emotional risk that comes with vulnerability. It becomes a game of how long they can stay in the spotlight of someone else's affection without actually revealing who they are beneath the surface. Their fear isn't that the other person will leave. It's that if they show their true self, the illusion will collapse. They fear that vulnerability will lead to rejection, disappointment, or emotional engulfment. So they protect their internal world by never fully opening the door. They learn how to be just enough, just interested enough, just affectionate enough, just connected enough to keep receiving love without giving away their power. But this also means they rarely experience the depth of emotional connection they secretly crave, even when they say they want a deep, meaningful relationship. Their behavior tells a different story. They unconsciously sabotage moments of closeness. They deflect compliments, avoid difficult conversations, then change the subject when emotions arise. It's not because they don't care, it's because caring too much feels dangerous. Validation gives them the emotional hit they need without the emotional exposure they fear. It's safe, it's controlled, and it doesn't require them to sit in the discomfort of being emotionally open. That's the cycle: seek attention, avoid connection, feel lonely, crave closeness. Repeat, they exist in the middle ground, never fully distant, never fully close, always reaching for the emotional high of being wanted while protecting themselves from the emotional risk of being known. Avoidants don't just stumble into certain relationship dynamics, they're drawn to them. Often without realizing it, they gravitate toward partners who feel familiar on a subconscious level. This familiarity isn't based on surface traits or shared interests. It's rooted in the emotional patterns they experienced early in life. If love once came with inconsistency, emotional distance, or unpredictability, that becomes the blueprint. It may not have felt good, but it felt normal. And what feels normal often feels safe, even when it's not. So the avoidant finds themselves fixating on partners who replicate the emotional rhythm they're used to. Someone who offers affection but pulls away. Someone who keeps them guessing. Someone who never quite makes them feel fully secure. There's a strange comfort in that chaos. It lets the avoidant engage without having to rewrite their emotional programming. If they were raised in an environment where emotional expression was met with criticism, neglect, or abandonment, they learn to self-soothe, to pull inward, to protect themselves. They also learn that love is something you reach for, but not something you ever fully hold. So when they meet a partner who is inconsistent, slightly detached, or emotionally unavailable, it doesn't raise alarms. It feels like home. Not because it's healthy, but because it mirrors the emotional survival patterns they developed long ago. This kind of familiarity pulls them in deeper than logic can explain. Even when they're hurt, confused, or frustrated by the relationship, they stay. They stay because the emotional dynamic feels like something they've known before. It might hurt, but it doesn't feel foreign. In fact, what often feels foreign to an avoidant is true emotional safety. A partner who is consistently present, emotionally open, and ready to build something real can trigger discomfort. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because they don't fit the mold of what love is supposed to feel like. If love never came easy before, easy now feels suspicious. If affection was always earned, unconditional love feels untrustworthy. So they sabotage, push away, or withdraw from people who might actually be good for them. The subconscious is powerful. It quietly leads them toward the familiar and away from the unknown, even when the unknown could be healthier. Even when they say they want something different, they might promise themselves not to repeat the same mistakes, but end up with a partner who triggers the same emotional patterns. This isn't weakness or a lack of awareness, it's emotional muscle memory. It's the subconscious trying to recreate a scenario it already knows how to survive. The avoidant may not realize they're doing it, but their nervous system is constantly scanning for what feels emotionally manageable. And for them, manageable doesn't always mean safe, it means familiar. Sometimes they're even more drawn to people who withhold affection or are slow to commit. These traits mimic the emotional inaccessibility they once had to navigate. They tell themselves they're just being selective, or that they want someone who doesn't overwhelm them. But in truth, they're choosing someone who won't ask them to confront their emotional walls, someone who makes it easy to stay closed, someone who never forces them to sit in the discomfort of being vulnerable. That's the real pull, the ability to stay protected while still feeling connected. Even their frustration becomes part of the cycle. They'll vent to friends, wonder why they always end up with emotionally distant partners, question whether they're just unlucky. But the truth is more complex. They're drawn to what their nervous system has labeled as love. And unless they consciously challenge that definition, they'll keep returning to the same emotional scenarios, expecting different outcomes. The problem isn't the people they choose, it's the emotional programming underneath those choices. It's not that they don't want love. They just don't trust it when it looks different from what they've known. They say they want closeness, but they chase it with people who can't truly offer it. They say they want consistency, but they're drawn to those who keep them guessing. They say they want someone who sees them, but they feel more chemistry with those who only see parts. The disconnect is deep, and until it's acknowledged, it runs the show. Subconscious familiarity isn't obvious at first, and it hides behind phrases like, "we just have chemistry," or "I can't explain why I'm drawn to them." But underneath is a pattern that began long before adult relationships ever entered the picture. The pattern of associating love with emotional distance, unpredictability, and conditional worth. Avoidants often find themselves more in love with the idea of someone than with who that person actually is. The fantasy partner becomes a placeholder for connection. Safe, distant, imagined. This partner isn't necessarily real in the emotional sense. They exist in a curated version of reality that allows the avoidant to feel desire without risk. The fantasy partner is perfect because they're incomplete. They haven't disappointed, exposed flaws, or made demands. Everything about the connection is shaped and filtered through the avoidant's internal world. It's love with the volume turned down, with control intact, and with vulnerability safely kept at a distance. This imagined connection have allowed it to stay emotionally stimulated while maintaining their defenses. The fantasy partner can be someone they briefly dated, someone they see from afar, or even someone they once had a fleeting emotional moment with. It doesn't take much for the fantasy to build because the less reality involved, the more room there is to idealize. Avoidants don't fall for people, they fall potential. For what someone could be if the timing were better, if life were easier, if they themselves were more ready. They construct elaborate emotional narratives around these people with ever needing to test them against real intimacy. It's a version of love where they never have to confront their own fears, shortcomings, or emotional patterns. In fantasy, there's no conflict. There's no need for uncomfortable conversations, emotional accountability, or the navigation of daily vulnerabilities. Maybe avoidant gets to feel the rush of desire, the ache of longing, and the comfort of connection, all while remaining firmly in control. There's no threat of being hurt because the relationship never becomes real enough to carry that risk. And yet, the emotions they feel are real about something. That's what makes the fantasy partner so powerful. The emotional highs are genuine. The longing is genuine, but it's all happening in a space that isn't grounded in emotional presence. This type of attachment often keeps the avoidant stuck. They compare real potential partners to the fantasy they've built and find those real people lacking. No one measures up to the perfection of someone who only exists in their head. As a result, they stay emotionally unavailable even while claiming to want connection. Maybe they tell themselves they're waiting for the right person, when in reality, they're chasing a connection that doesn't require emotional risk. It gives them an out, a way to stay single, distant, or detached while maintaining the illusion that they're open to love. It's not that they don't want a relationship. It's that the fantasy one feels safer than the real thing. When the avoidant is involved with someone emotionally present, someone who wants to truly connect, that person begins to threaten the fantasy. They reflect the avoidant's fear back to them by requiring emotional depth, consistency, and vulnerability. The avoidant might suddenly feel bored, suffocated, or unsure, not because the relationship is lacking, but because it doesn't match the emotional template they've built around their fantasy partner. The fantasy requires nothing. Reality requires everything. And that's where avoidance becomes protection. As long as the avoidant is longing for someone they can't fully have, they don't have to risk being fully seen. Sometimes the fantasy partner is someone from the past, a person they never fully let go of, not because the relationship was healthy, but because it remained unresolved. That lack of closure keeps the story alive. It allows the avoidant to revisit the memory, to reimagine what could have been, to hold on to the emotional thread with ever needing to face the truth of why it ended. This kind of attachment is difficult to break because it feels deeply personal. It's not just about the person. They've become a symbol of safety, of longing, of love about something, of love without danger. The avoidant not even realize they're doing it. They can go months, even years, cycling through real relationships while secretly holding space for someone else. They might not talk about it, but it shows in their behavior. The hesitancy The comparisons, the way they withhold just enough of themselves to keep emotional distance. The fantasy becomes a barrier, a quiet, constant presence that makes every real connection feel just slightly off. It's not about who's right in front of them. It's about the emotional attachment they haven't released. At its core, the fantasy partner allows the avoidant to stay emotionally alive while avoiding emotional intimacy. It gives them something to yearn for without requiring growth. It offers the illusion of connection without the reality of emotional labor. The fantasy partner doesn't challenge them, doesn't reflect their fears, doesn't ask them to show up in ways they don't know how to yet. It's easier to hold on to the hope of what could be than to step into the discomfort of what is.